What if the role that made you famous also threatened to define, and even destroy, your life? And what if, after decades of success, controversy, and heartbreak, there was still one woman who quietly remained at the center of your story? Sean Connery's public image was larger than life. Fearless, magnetic, impossibly self-assured. But behind the tuxedo and the martini was a man shaped by hardship, ambition, loyalty, pride, and regret. For those of us who have lived long enough to understand that success rarely comes without sacrifice, his journey feels less like a Hollywood fairy tale and more like a cautionary chronicle of fame's hidden cost. Because what does it truly mean to win the world, if parts of your private life begin to slip through your fingers? The making of a fighter. Long before the tailored suits and shaken martinis, he was Thomas Sean Connery, Big Tam, a working-class boy from Fountainbridge, Edinburgh. He grew up in a cramped tenement flat where the walls were thin, the winters unforgiving, and money always scarce. His father, Joseph, drove trucks and labored in factories. His mother, Euphemia, scrubbed floors in other people's homes. There was dignity in their work, but there was no comfort. No indulgence. No illusions. Connery delivered milk before dawn as a teenager, rising while the city still slept, the cold air biting at his face as he hauled heavy bottles door to door. The streets were quiet then, just him, the clatter of glass, and the steady rhythm of responsibility. There were no shortcuts. No inherited connections. No safety nets. He left school at 13. By 16, restless and eager to prove himself, he joined the Royal Navy. It felt like an escape, a chance to carve out identity beyond the narrow lanes of Fountainbridge. He had 2 tattoos inked on his arm, Mum and Dad, and Scotland Forever. They were more than decoration. They were declarations of loyalty. Of origin. But life had other plans. By his early 20s, he was medically discharged with a painful stomach ulcer. Just like that, the structure was gone. He returned to Edinburgh uncertain, frustrated, and adrift. He polished coffins at a local factory. He posed nude for art students to earn a few pounds. He dug ditches. He drove trucks. He lifted weights obsessively, building not just muscle but armor, the imposing physique that would later command the screen. It's easy to look at the finished icon and forget the years of uncertainty that shaped him. At 23, an extraordinary opportunity appeared. He was offered a trial to play football for Manchester United. Imagine that moment. A working-class Scottish boy, standing on the edge of a dream many would give everything for. Most young men would have grabbed it without hesitation. Fame. Glory. Security. Connery paused. He calculated the short lifespan of a professional sports career. He considered injury, age, and the narrow window of opportunity. Acting, though uncertain, offered longevity. He walked away from Manchester United. How many of us, at 23, would have had that kind of foresight? Or that kind of nerve? That decision altered the trajectory of his life. From chorus boy to Hollywood target. Connery's entry into acting was not born of childhood fantasy but of circumstance. A bodybuilding friend mentioned auditions for a touring production of South Pacific. Connery went along, partly curious, partly desperate for direction. He landed a role in the chorus. He couldn't sing particularly well. He couldn't dance particularly well. But he learned. He watched. He absorbed. Then came small parts. Touring theater. Television appearances. Minor film roles. At night, he educated himself. Shakespeare. Tolstoy. Oscar Wilde. He took elocution lessons to soften his thick Scottish accent, though he never erased it entirely. He practiced posture. Voice control. Movement. He wasn't born refined. He constructed refinement. But Hollywood wasn't only glamour and opportunity, it was also volatility and danger. While filming Another Time, another place opposite Lana Turner, rumors swirled about an off-screen romance. Turner's volatile partner, gangster Johnny Stompanato, flew to London in a jealous rage. According to accounts, he confronted Connery backstage at gunpoint. What would you do in that moment? Connery reportedly disarmed him. The confrontation did not end there. Shortly afterward, Stompanato was killed in a domestic altercation involving Turner's teenage daughter. The press frenzy intensified. There were whispers of mob retaliation. Connery was quietly advised to leave town. Before Bond. Before global superstardom. Before knighthood. This was not myth. This was survival. How many rising stars would have crumbled under that pressure? Connery kept working. The woman he almost married. In those early years of struggle, photographer Julie Hamilton became his anchor. She saw him before the world did, not as a future icon, but as an ambitious, restless young man trying to climb out of obscurity. When she was diagnosed with tuberculosis, Connery faced a pivotal decision. A major film opportunity beckoned, the kind of role that could propel his career forward. He turned it down. He chose to stay by her side. Pause and consider that. A struggling actor refusing a breakthrough chance for love. Would you have done the same? Their relationship, however, did not survive the shifting tides of ambition and circumstance. It ended abruptly, painfully. The details remain private, but the emotional imprint lingered. Years later, Connery made a promise. If he ever had a son, he would name him Jason, in honor of Julie. He kept that promise. What does that say about the man behind the legend? Becoming Bond, and losing control. When producers Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman began searching for the first James Bond, author Ian Fleming had doubts about Connery. Too rough. Too working class. Not refined enough to embody a British secret agent. But the producers saw something else. Danger. Sexual confidence. Physical authority. Connery leaned into his identity. He didn't attempt to erase his background. He infused Bond with raw masculinity, a hint of menace beneath the charm. Dr. No premiered in 1962. The cultural explosion was immediate. The suits. The smirk. The gun barrel walk. The voice, unmistakable, velvety, commanding. Bond wasn't simply a character. He became a global phenomenon. And Connery became inseparable from him. But with that came suffocating pressure. He married actress Diane Salento in 1962. They had a son, Jason. For a moment, it seemed he had balanced ambition with domestic life. But Bond mania was relentless. 5 films in rapid succession. Endless interviews. Airports. Red carpets. Hotel rooms. Expectations. Fame can magnify success and fracture intimacy. Connery began to resent the machine that surrounded him. He felt overexposed, undervalued, trapped by the very role that made him a star. His marriage deteriorated under the strain. Arguments turned public. Accusations surfaced. By 1971, the relationship ended in divorce. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the opportunity you fight hardest for becomes the force that destabilizes your private world. Have you ever chased something so fiercely that you didn't see what it was costing you? Rebellion, return, and reinvention. Connery refused to remain imprisoned by Bond. He sought complexity. He worked with Alfred Hitchcock in Marnie. He collaborated with Sidney Lumet. He starred alongside Michael Caine in The Man Who Would Be King, delivering one of his most layered performances. He wanted to prove, perhaps to the industry, perhaps to himself, that he was more than a franchise. Yet Bond lingered. The producers coaxed him back for Diamonds Are Forever in 1971, and this time he negotiated fiercely. A record salary. Financing for personal projects. Creative leverage. That negotiation revealed a shift. Connery was no longer the grateful newcomer. He understood his value. He used part of his earnings to establish a trust supporting Scottish artists, a gesture rooted in loyalty to his homeland. Isn't it fascinating how success can either distance us from our origins, or deepen our commitment to them? Still, he stepped away again. Then, years later, in 1983, he returned once more in Never Say Never Again, a title that felt almost autobiographical. By then, he was older, wryly self-aware, comfortable enough to play Bond with a touch of irony. He had made peace with the role, but on his own terms. Love, stability, and a second act. In 1975, Connery married French-Moroccan painter Micheline Roquebrune. Their meeting, by chance at a golf tournament, blossomed into a partnership that would endure for decades. Unlike the whirlwind of his first marriage, this union brought relative stability. Micheline was independent, artistic, and uninterested in Hollywood theatrics. She understood his pride, his need for privacy. His fierce attachment to Scotland. Was she the quiet center of gravity he had long needed? Friends observed that Connery softened over time. He still possessed volcanic temper and unwavering opinions, but there was a grounded quality to his later years. He won an Academy Award for The Untouchables in 1988, proving definitively that he had transcended Bond. Roles in Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, The Hunt for Red October, and The Rock introduced him to new generations. He wasn't chasing youth. He was embodying authority. There's a difference. The complicated legacy. No life, especially one lived in the spotlight, is without controversy. Connery's outspoken views on Scottish independence divided audiences. His comments in interviews about discipline and relationships sparked backlash decades later. His relationship with his son Jason reportedly remained strained for years. Can a man be both admirable and flawed? Both pioneering and imperfect? That complexity is what makes his story human. He retired from acting after The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen in 2003, frustrated with the filmmaking process and unwilling to compromise further. He withdrew to the Bahamas, valuing privacy over relevance. In 2000, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II, Sir Sean Connery. A boy from Fountainbridge had become a global icon. But even icons age. In his final years, dementia clouded the sharp mind that once negotiated contracts and delivered razor-edged dialogue. Micheline remained by his side until his death in 2020. When he passed at 90, tributes poured in from across the world. Yet beyond the accolades, one question lingered. Who was he, truly, when the cameras stopped? The deeper question. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of Sean Connery's story isn't Bond. It isn't the Oscar. It isn't the knighthood. It's the tension between ambition and intimacy. Between identity and expectation. Between public triumph and private cost. How do we hold on to ourselves while the world tries to mold us? How do we measure success, by applause, or by the relationships that endure? And if we could step back in time, would we choose differently? Sean Connery's life reminds us that reinvention is possible. That walking away can be as powerful as stepping forward. That loyalty to one's roots can coexist with global fame. But it also warns us, no victory comes without trade-offs. For those who have built careers, raised families, chased dreams, and felt the weight of sacrifice, his journey resonates. Because in the end, the man who once ordered martinis, shaken, not stirred, spent his final years seeking something far quieter. Peace. And perhaps that is the most revealing role he ever played. He was, of course, the world's first James Bond for most of a generation. The lean, laconic Scot whose presence filled screens and filled imaginations. But Connery refused to be pigeonholed. Later came The Untouchables, which earned him an Academy Award. Then Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, where he played a witty, aging father, a role that introduced him to a new generation. He wasn't just Bond anymore. He had endured. But endurance has texture. It is built from choices, small and large. At times Connery chose notoriety. At other times he chose absence. He walked away from projects he found hollow and leaned into parts that allowed him to surprise himself. He cultivated a voice that could be charming and threatening in the same breath, a quality that made him irresistible on screen and complicated in print. Controversy and complexity. Connery's legacy was never spotless. Affair rumors followed him for decades. Former partners made public allegations. Old interviews resurfaced, sparking criticism about his views on relationships. He denied wrongdoing and defended himself, but debate never fully faded. For a generation that understands that greatness and imperfection often coexist, Connery's story raises difficult questions. Can a man be both admirable and flawed? Can we celebrate achievement while acknowledging controversy? Life, as we know, is rarely simple. Beyond the public persona lay the private man, quick-witted, protective of privacy, and fiercely attached to certain principles. Friends recalled a man who could cut a room with a grin and then close the door to the world when needed. He loved Scotland fiercely, the lochs and the low light, and often spoke with longing about the small things that kept him steady, a quiet walk by the sea, an afternoon with a good book, the comfort of a routine. Could these small rituals have been the anchors that preserve his center? Those small routines, a walk, a book, a quiet breakfast, were the scaffolding that held the rest together. What did those ordinary things mean to a man who had been watched his whole life? The one woman he never got over. After his divorce, Connery dated widely. But in 1970, at a golf tournament in Morocco, he met French-Moroccan painter Micheline Roquebrune. She didn't recognize him at first. To her, he was simply an attractive, athletic stranger. She later described dreaming of him before they properly met. Their connection was immediate, intense, complicated, because he was still married at the time. They separated for nearly 2 years after that first encounter. No contact. No promises. Then they reunited in Spain. Connery admitted he had never stopped thinking about her. And this time, he didn't let her go. They married in 1975, deliberately misleading the press about the date to protect their privacy. Unlike his first marriage, this one endured. Decades passed. Fame rose and fell. Controversies came and went. Micheline remained. They eventually settled in the Bahamas, living quietly, far from Hollywood's glare. Friends described their relationship as playful and affectionate even into old age. They moved through houses and islands with a kind of companionable rhythm, plotting small rebellions against celebrity, private holidays, rude jokes over dinner, arguments about tomatoes. For a man who had been chased by mobs, adored by millions, and entangled in public drama, this stability mattered. Isn't it striking that after all the glamour, the thing that lasted was something simple: companionship? Character in quiet places. Imagine Connery walking the shoreline of a Bahamian evening, the sky trading gold for blue, mare's tails skimming the horizon. Imagine the gait of a man who had once commanded sets and studios now measured his steps by tide and wind. What does it mean for a legend to shrink the map of his life to a single island? Perhaps it was a chosen simplicity. Fewer interviews, fewer tailored suits, more time to learn to cook a dish properly, more time to garden, more time to listen. Behind the suits and the cigar smoke was a person who could be domestic and tender. He cherished the rituals of a shared life, and that tenderness became its own kind of fame, away from cameras and critics. Is it possible that renown, for him, eventually became a tool rather than a trophy, something to be used when needed and set aside when not? The trade-offs were not only social. There were artistic ones. Turning down scripts, walking away from franchises, protecting privacy, each decision altered the arc of his artistic legacy. In stepping back, he opened himself to new roles, yes, but also to a quieter reputation that prioritized authenticity over ubiquitous presence. If you were offered the whole world, what would you give up to keep the parts of yourself that mattered most? There are also moments of surprising humor in the quieter chapters. A misremembered line from a vintage script, a stubborn disagreement over how to roast a chicken, a clumsy attempt at gardening that ended in laughter. These human slips, trivial, unglamorous, humanize a man whose image was otherwise monumental. Why do we find such relief in the small fails of the famous? Does watching them fumble a domestic task make them more real to us? Final years and farewell. In his later years, Connery battled dementia. Friends spoke of the heartbreak of watching a once commanding presence slowly fade. He died peacefully in 2020 at age 90, with Micheline by his side. His ashes were eventually returned to Scotland, scattered at St. Andrews, a place he loved. Fitting, isn't it? A global icon. A knight of the realm. Yet in the end, he came home. Those final chapters are quiet but searing. They remind us that even the most public lives end in private rooms and small gestures, the holding of a hand, the closing of a curtain, the telling of an old joke to a familiar face. In the echo of such simple acts, we often find the truest measure of a life. What his life really tells us. Sean Connery's story isn't just about Bond. It's about reinvention. It's about the cost of ambition. It's about loyalty tested, and sometimes broken. And ultimately, it's about enduring love. He walked away from Manchester United. He turned down roles for love. He wrestled with fame. He returned to the spotlight, and then chose to leave it behind. And through it all, one woman remained the constant in his final decades. For those of us who've lived long enough to see dreams achieved, relationships strained, and priorities shift, his life feels deeply human. So let me ask you, when the applause fades, what truly matters? The career, the recognition, or the person who stays beside you when the cameras are gone? Sean Connery may have been the world's most famous spy. But in the end, he was simply a man, searching, striving, stumbling, loving, like the rest of us. Which role do you think revealed him most? The artful play of Bond, the moral complexity of Malone in The Untouchables, or the warm patience of a father in Indiana Jones? If someone you love chose a quieter life in their later years, how would you feel about their choices? Would you see it as retreat, wisdom, or something else entirely? There is also another question tucked inside this story. What do we owe to the people who have shaped us? Connery borrowed from the world, and the world borrowed from him. He taught actors how to carry a line, taught audiences how to listen, and taught generations how complicated courage can look. Who taught him? Which mentors, friends, or early failures carved out the space for the man he became? His life compels us to look at our own choices, the balancing of ambition and intimacy, risk and refuge. How do we want to be remembered? By our headlines, or by the small, steady acts that stitch a life together? In the end, perhaps his most enduring lesson is this: fame is a stage, but peace is a home. Which would you choose? Would you trade applause for a single steady hand? Are you living a life you'd choose again?